Just prior to the Revolutionary War, a colony was established in what's now West Virginia along the Kanawha River just below Point Pleasant. Now, this colony would be known as one of the first settlements in Appalachia had the man behind its founding not had other important duties to attend to. Today, we tell the story of George Washington's lost Appalachian colony. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, A History of Appalachia.
Steve, once again, we've got another podcast that has to do with George Washington, and we've already told a story about George Washington getting all this land and so forth, and how much it was in dispute. Now, that was, I take it to be prior to this, but this is really interesting because it just shows that George Washington had more of an impact and influence, so to speak, in Appalachia than a lot of people believed.
Well, this incident we're talking about today actually started prior to the Revolutionary War. The other one up in Pennsylvania was after the Revolutionary War.
Okay. So we've kind of got this cleared up now, and we've kind of got the idea that George Washington was involved with land. That's what he was involved in.
He was a land speculator.
Yes,
but before he could be a land speculator, folks, he had to have land. And this is how that happened. In 1754, war was imminent between two of the great European colonial powers in North America, England and France, over control of the Ohio River Valley and northern Appalachia. Now, soldiers were needed to fight the French, so Royal Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia came up with a way to recruit them. That year, he issued a proclamation promising to give every man who enlisted in the Virginia militia land on the frontier in the western part of the state, what's now West Virginia. In total, over 200,000 acres were promised to the brave men who joined up to fight the French. And among those soldiers, Rod, was George Washington.
That's right. But by the end of the French and Indian War, Steve, conflict between the settlers who had moved into Appalachia and the Native Americans who were already there had reached a boiling point. So King George III issued the Proclamation Line in 1763, barring white settlement west of that line. This created a problem for the veterans of the French and Indian War. They had land given to them, but they couldn't settle on it. George Washington's land was out of his reach, but he was not a man to be stopped by the mere line on a map.
Oh, no, not a bit. By the fall of 1764, Washington decided to take matters into his own hands. He hired a man named William Crawford to find and survey the richest pieces of property out west for him, even if he couldn't yet get his hands on it. Washington was certain he would eventually be able to figure out a way around that proclamation line and get his land, as well as assure that all the other soldiers would be able to get theirs too. He sent Crawford a letter setting out his plans and asked him to prepare to take on a secret mission to scout out his future property. Now, Crawford sent Washington a reply letter in which he shared what he already knew of the land in that part of Virginia and of lands near Fort Pitt or present-day Pittsburgh. Now, Washington waited until he felt it was the right time and then petitioned the governor of Virginia for the land that he and the other veterans were promised. Well, the governor officially granted Washington the right to hire a qualified surveyor to locate and allocate that land to Virginia Regiment veterans. Who, Rod, I wonder, did George Washington pick as that surveyor?
I would guess it would probably be William Crawford. Because William Crawford was chosen as the surveyor of the soldier land. Now, what the governor never knew was that he had been doing that work for the last 5 years, kind of undercover, discreetly, not telling a whole lot of people, under the employment of Washington himself. In 1770, George Washington, 3 of his servants, and his close friend and personal doctor, Dr. James Craik, set out to the western frontier. They traveled along with surveyor William Crawford up to Fort Pitt, then headed down the Ohio River by canoe to the mouth of the Kanawha River at the present-day Point Pleasant. The group then turned up into the Kanawha and then traveled that river upstream about 15 miles, and at one point meeting a group of Indians.
Now, Dr. Craig's account of the meeting reports that one Indian chief prophesied that George Washington was someday going to become the leader and father of a mighty empire.
Hmm.
Now, this chief had recognized Washington as the leader of a group of soldiers with whom he had fought a battle. It was also reported by Craig that this chief said that Washington had the wisdom of a Native American and would be protected in battle by the Great Spirit. Now, after several weeks in the wilderness, Washington, Craig, and Crawford returned to Mount Vernon.
In total, William Crawford surveyed 64,000 acres of land, about 23,000 of which was for George Washington. One tract of that Washington land, 10,990 acres, was along the southern bank of the Kanawha River, snaking up about 17 to 18 miles along the river, starting about 2 miles upriver from the intersection of the Kanawha and the Ohio, and about a half-mile wide due to the mountainous lay of the land. This land was formally granted to Washington on December 15th, 1772. But in the spring of 1774, Washington hired William Crawford's brother, Valentine. Wow, what a name. To try to develop the Kanawha River tract of land and establish a colony there. I'm sure George just said, Valentine, go find me a colony there. Is that what he did, Steve?
Well, basically, that's what he did. And George Washington ended up sending a detailed letter to tell him exactly what to do. And what he said was this, and I'm going to quote this from the letter that Washington wrote. You are to proceed without loss of time to your own settlement on Youghiogheny, and if there it is not already done, provide such and so much provision as you shall think necessary to take down with you to my lands on the Ohio. Now, you're also to provide canoes for transporting those provisions, the tools, and the workmen. You are to engage 3 good hands as laborers to be employed in this business. You are to get them upon the best terms you can, and have them bound in articles to serve till the 1st of December, duly and truly, at the expiration of which term they shall receive their wages, provisions, and tools will be found them, but nothing else. You are also to engage a good hunter upon the best terms you can, for the purpose of supplying you with provisions. Let him have the skins, as I suppose he will engage the cheaper for it. So there you can see, Rod, that Washington himself was micromanaging his little colony all the way out west. But before the expedition could even get started, war got in the way.
That's right, Steve, because in 1774, Lord Dunmore's War broke out between the Native Americans and the Virginia militia and the settlers in the region, ending with the Indians' defeat in the Battle of Point Pleasant in October of that year. In 1774, the expedition to the Kanawha River was canceled. In the spring of 1775, Washington was set to settle his colony along the Kanawha, and at this time, he had some competition. Another group of land speculators, supported by none other than the father of electricity. No, Benjamin Franklin was preparing to set up a 14th English colony in the region to be known as Vandalia, with its capital proposed to be at today's Point Pleasant, at the confluence of the Kanawha and the Ohio rivers, just 2 miles away from Washington's land. Time, Steve, was of the essence in this matter.
It sure was. This time, Washington appointed as his point man James Cleveland. Now, Cleveland, along with his assistant William Stevens and several indentured servants, slaves, and a Captain Russell, headed to the Great Bend of the Kanawha River across from today's Leon, West Virginia, to set up that colony. Now, Washington sent a letter along with the expedition and again gave strict, detailed instructions on what to do. Plant corn, plant potatoes, plant peas, establish a peach orchard, clear land, and put up buildings. He also thought of, and this is a kind of a novel idea, he thought of capturing buffalo in the area and corralling them to be raised as some kind of native cattle, kind of taming them.
had a good idea there.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that turned out.
Yeah, but buffalo are hard to contain too,
Yes,
Steve.
they are. 14 buildings were established, many of them houses, along with one barn. 28 acres of forest were cleared and a garden planted, and 2,000 peach trees were also planted.
There was also conflict with the Native Americans in the area who sank the colony's canoes and robbed it of food and tools. Not a great way to get things started. The fish weren't biting. Servants and slaves started running away, and worse, the local garrison at Fort Blair was shut down by the British due to the growing conflict with the American colonies, as if anything else couldn't go wrong. Washington noted in his letter that he had planned to visit the site that summer to see what progress had been made. Boy, was he going to get a surprise when he got there, wasn't he, Steve?
Well, he would have gotten a surprise. That's
Yes.
indeed. You see, Mr. Cleveland was growing increasingly desperate. In fact, he sent 3 letters to Washington at Mount Vernon, each one more desperate than the last, seeking help for the colony. That last one was sent in November 1775, but, well, he didn't really get a chance to read it because by that time, the Revolutionary War was in full swing, and George Washington was now the commander of American forces and never made it to his Kanawha River colony, nor was he able to send the help James Cleveland desperately needed. And by the time the Revolution was over, Washington's colony was no more, having completely disappeared. The men he sent to establish the settlement, Rod, they were never heard from again. There are no ruins of the peach orchards, the gardens, or the buildings that they'd erected. The forests retook everything. And no one knows why or what exactly happened to this colony, making it truly George Washington's lost colony. But I do have to say this. Is it possible that George Washington was the victim of a big old, I don't know, lie? Maybe these guys went out there, just kept the money and didn't do anything?
You wouldn't be saying anything about a conspiracy theory now, would you, Steve?
No, that's just a little supposition. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it could very well have been because, I mean, these guys, how much money was being put down. I guess that was a lot per se for this time. And then everything else, Washington was kind of sinking money into this. And while he was sinking money, the Indians were sinking the boats and they were doing a lot of other things at the same time. So I think that there was a little bit of 2 different factors kind of going along with this. The men might have been looking for a way out because they knew nothing was going to be able to succeed there. And, maybe it was something boastful too, that the Indians kind of pumped Washington up, so to speak, to make him think, I've got better things to look forward to. Who knows how this thing would have went.
Well, an interesting story. And I'll be honest, I hadn't really ever heard of this. I mean, I'd heard of Vandalia and I'd heard of Benjamin Franklin, but I wasn't aware that George Washington tried to set up a colony.
No, that was news to me too. I didn't know anything about it. I thought that he had mostly stayed, like we had talked about before, Pennsylvania, through there, and then of course down through at least a little bit of the Shenandoah Valley, but not anything like this. So it was a little bit of a, I don't know, a little bit of a reach, taking a little bit of a chance with this, so to speak, from George Washington, and he came up empty-handed.
Oh, well. Well, folks, that's the story of George Washington's lost colony in Appalachia. Another bit of the history of this place we call home. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast in a whole lot of different ways, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and so on and so on and so on. Please go down there and subscribe to us. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.